Welcome to Lights Out Stories. New stories drop every week. If you want to be here when they do, hit subscribe and settle in. Tonight's story is called Before the Sky Fell. It's about the men aboard the ships at Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th, 1941. Ordinary men from ordinary places who woke up on a Sunday morning and found themselves in the middle of history, and who fought back with everything they had. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, and let's get into it. It was a Sunday. That detail matters more than it might seem. Sunday at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 had a specific character. The pace of the base slowed on Sundays. The formal routines of a Navy installation, the watches, the drills, the constant hum of organized activity that filled the week, gave way to something quieter. Men slept in. They wrote letters home. They played cards and read and looked out at the water of the harbor and thought about things the way you think about things when you're 20 years old and far from home, and the morning is warm and still, and nothing is required of you for a few hours. It was the last Sunday that would feel like that for a very long time. James Kowalski was 19 years old. He was from Pittsburgh, the son of a steelworker, the youngest of 4 boys, a kid who had grown up with the smell of the mills and the sound of his father coming home tired, and the particular kind of pride that comes from a family that works hard at difficult things without making much of it. He had enlisted in the Navy in the spring of 1940, at 17, with his mother's signature on the papers, because he was not yet legally old enough to sign them himself. He had chosen the Navy because of a photograph, a picture in a magazine of a battleship at sea, grey and massive against a grey ocean. And something in the image had reached him in a way he could not have articulated then and cannot fully articulate now. He was a machinist's mate aboard the USS West Virginia. The West Virginia was a battleship, 48,000 tons of steel, 524 feet long, armed with 8 16-inch guns that could send a projectile 20 miles. She sat in Battleship Row on the southeast side of Ford Island, in the center of Pearl Harbor, moored outboard alongside the USS Tennessee. Jimmy, no one called him James aboard ship, had been on the West Virginia for 14 months. He knew her the way you know a place you spend most of your hours in. The sounds she made, the way she moved in a swell, the particular rhythm of the machinery spaces where he worked, the heat and the noise and the smell of oil and metal that was, by now, as familiar to him as the smell of his mother's kitchen. His bunkmate was a young man from Georgia named Thomas Reeves. Tom was 21 and had been in the Navy 3 years and had the easy authority of someone who had figured out how things worked and was content to let that knowledge carry him. He and Jimmy had been friends since Jimmy came aboard. The friendship of proximity and shared circumstance that the Navy manufactures efficiently. 2 young men from different places finding common ground in the specific daily reality of life aboard a ship. On the morning of December 7th, Tom was still asleep when Jimmy woke. It was a few minutes before 8. The harbor was quiet. Jimmy had come up to the main deck for air. It was something he did on mornings when he woke before he needed to. He liked the harbor in the early morning, the way the water lay flat, and the light came across it at a low angle, and the ships sat in their moorings like a city of steel islands, each one a world of its own. Hundreds of men inside each hull, beginning their Sunday in their separate ways. He stood at the rail and looked east toward the mountains. The sky was clear, or a deep, cloudless blue of the kind that the Hawaiian morning produces, with a consistency that still surprised him. He had not grown up with sky like this, Pittsburgh's sky being a different and more variable thing. He was thinking about breakfast. He was thinking about a letter he needed to write to his mother. He was not thinking about anything particular when he heard the sound. It came from the north, a sound that was at first indistinct, a hum, a drone, something mechanical and distant that grew as he stood at the rail trying to place it. He had heard aircraft before. The harbour was full of military air activity, but this sound was different in its density, in the number of engines producing it. He looked north. He saw them. A formation of aircraft, low over the hills, coming in from the direction of the mountains. And for a fraction of a second, his mind reached for an explanation that made sense. An exercise, a drill, something scheduled that he hadn't heard about. And then the first explosion happened. It happened at the airfield on Ford Island. A column of black smoke went up. Then another. Then the sound of the explosions reached him, 2 beats after the visual. And by the time the sound arrived, he already knew what was happening, because the aircraft were now close enough to see the markings on their wings. The red circle on a white field. And the knowledge arrived not as a thought, but as something physical. A change in the quality of the air around him. He ran. General quarters. The alarm that means every man to his battle station, immediately and without exception, and without the need for further instruction, was sounding throughout the ship before Jimmy had reached the hatch to go below. He could hear it as he ran. That specific sound, urgent and continuous, that transforms a ship from a community of men going about their individual mornings into a single fighting organism. Men appeared from everywhere, from their bunks, from the mess decks, from the heads and the passageways and the compartments where they had been reading or sleeping or doing the quiet Sunday things that Sunday permitted. They moved fast, with the automatic purposefulness of training that had been repeated until it required no thought, each man going to the place he was supposed to be. Jimmy's battle station was in the machinery spaces below the waterline. He went down. The West Virginia was hit in the first minutes. Torpedoes, Japanese aircraft, Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, though Jimmy did not know their designation, only that they came low and fast over the harbour waters and released their weapons in shallow runs designed specifically for the shallow depth of Pearl Harbor, struck the port side of the ship in rapid succession. The first hit threw him against a bulkhead. In the machinery space, below the waterline, the attack was experienced differently from how it appeared from above. There was no visual. There was only sound and impact. A concussion that you felt in your chest before you heard it. The groan of stressed metal. The immediate change in the ship's behavior. A list beginning. The deck tilting slightly under his feet. A degree, 2 degrees. The weight of water beginning to redistribute. He worked. The training took over. Not courage exactly. not in that moment. The deliberate decisions and the considered actions came later. In the first minutes, it was something more automatic than courage. The body doing what it had been taught to do. The hands going to the valves and the controls that his specific role required. The mind narrowing to the immediate task. Counter-flooding. If a ship is hit on one side and begins to list, you can counter-flood, deliberately fill compartments on the opposite side with water to level the ship. It sounds counterintuitive. You are putting water into a ship that is already taking water. But the alternative is a progressive list that ends in capsizing. In the ship rolling onto its side with hundreds of men inside. The order came from the damage control officer. Jimmy and the men around him executed it. Above decks, the harbour was transformed. The attack had arrived in 2 waves, the first at 7:48, the second following 50 minutes later. And between them, and within them, the harbour experienced something that had no precedent in American military history. 353 Japanese aircraft operating in coordinated strikes against the airfields, the ships, the fuel storage, the dry docks. The USS Arizona, moored just ahead of the West Virginia, was struck by an armor-piercing bomb that penetrated her forward deck and reached her ammunition magazine. The resulting explosion was of a scale that men who witnessed it struggled to describe afterward. The forward section of the ship rose from the water, and the fireball reached hundreds of feet into the sky, and the shock wave was felt throughout the harbour. The Arizona sank in 9 minutes. 1,177 men went with her. The Oklahoma, moored on the other side of Ford Island, was struck by torpedoes and capsized. She rolled completely onto her side, trapping hundreds of men in the air pockets inside her inverted hull. Men who survived the initial attack and the flooding found themselves in darkness, in compartments that were slowly filling, banging on the hull with whatever they could find. People on shore and on nearby ships could hear them. Rescue parties with acetylene torches worked through the day and into the night, and the following days cutting through the hull. 32 men were pulled out alive. More than 400 were not reached in time. The West Virginia settled on the bottom. Not capsized. The counter-flooding and the actions of her crew in those first desperate minutes had kept her upright, even as the water rose. She sat on the mud of the harbour floor, with her main deck just above the waterline, burning from the fuel oil that had ignited on the harbour surface around her. She lost 106 men. Jimmy was not one of them. He was below decks when the order came to abandon ship. He came up through a hatch into a world that bore almost no resemblance to the harbour he had been looking at 40 minutes earlier. The water around the ship was on fire. Burning oil spreading from the stricken vessels, covering the harbour surface in a sheet of flame through which men were swimming, had to swim, from ships that were sinking or burning or both. He went into the water. He did not think about it. He went in. The water was warm. The harbour was always warm. But the surface was burning, and the smoke was dense, and the sounds around him, the aircraft still overhead, the anti-aircraft guns still firing, men in the water calling out, the roar of the fires on the surrounding ships made it difficult to hear anything clearly or to think in the ordered way that training was supposed to produce. He swam. He reached a motor launch that was pulling men from the water and was pulled aboard by a sailor whose name he never learned and whose face he would remember for the rest of his life without being able to describe it. Tom Reeves had made it off the ship before him. They found each other on the Ford Island shore, among the hundreds of men who had come off the stricken battleships and who stood or sat or lay on the grass and the concrete, blackened with oil and smoke, some wounded, some in shock, some simply standing and looking out at what had happened to the harbour. The harbour was unrecognizable. The ships that Jimmy had stood at the rail looking at 2 hours earlier, the ordered ranks of battleships that had seemed permanent in their size and their solidity, the steel city on the water, were burning, sinking, capsized. The Arizona was gone, her superstructure jutting from the surface of the water in a column of black smoke. The Oklahoma lay on her side. The California and the West Virginia sat on the bottom. The Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, had been run aground at the harbour entrance to prevent her from sinking in the channel and blocking it. Tom looked at the West Virginia. He said nothing. Jimmy said nothing either. There was nothing to say that the sight itself was not already saying. They fought back. This is the part that gets lost sometimes in the accounting of casualties and damage, the shock of the attack, the scale of the loss, the questions that would follow about warning and readiness, and the decisions made in the days before. The men fought back. Anti-aircraft guns on the ships were manned within minutes of the first attack. In some cases, within seconds. Men went to their gun stations on ships that were already sinking. Men continued to fire on attacking aircraft, while the decks tilted under them. Gun crews on the Nevada fired until the ship ran aground. Sailors on the California, her forward decks awash with rising water, kept their guns in action through both waves of the attack. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft in the raid, 64 airmen. Every one of them was shot down by men who had been asleep 20 minutes earlier, men who had woken to find their harbour under attack, their ships on fire, their world transformed, and who had gone to their guns and done what they were there to do. Chief Boatswain's Mate Edwin Hill of the Nevada went over the side at the height of the attack to cast off the ship's mooring lines by hand so she could get underway. He was killed by strafing fire while in the water after completing the task. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. Mess Attendant Doris Miller, not an officer, not a gunner, a man whose assigned role gave him no combat position, took control of an unmanned anti-aircraft gun on the West Virginia's deck and fired it through the attack. He had received no training on the weapon. He fired it anyway. He was awarded the Navy Cross. There are hundreds of stories like these. Not the story of men overwhelmed and defeated. The story of men who absorbed the first blow and fought back. The attack ended at 9:45 in the morning. Less than 2 hours. In less than 2 hours, the United States Pacific Fleet had lost 8 battleships. 4 sunk or capsized, 4 damaged. 188 aircraft destroyed, most of them on the ground. 2,403 Americans killed. 1,178 wounded. The silence that followed was not the Sunday morning silence that Jimmy had stood in at the ship's rail. It was a different silence. The silence of a place where something enormous has just finished happening, and the scale of what happened is still arriving. He sat on the Ford Island shore with Tom Reeves and watched the smoke. The Arizona was still burning. She would burn for 2 days. The days that followed had a dreamlike quality. The work was immediate and relentless. Rescue operations on the capsized Oklahoma continued. Damage assessment on every ship. Medical support for the wounded, of whom there were more than the island's facilities had been built to handle. The practical tasks of a military installation that had absorbed a blow of this scale and had to keep functioning. Jimmy worked. He was not a man given to sitting with things he could not change while there were things he could act on. This was his father's way. Not cold, not unfeeling, but oriented toward the next task. The thing in front of you, the work your hands could do. He helped with salvage operations. He helped carry the wounded. He did what was needed. The way men do in the aftermath of catastrophe, when the catastrophe is still present and the needs are immediate, and there is no time yet to sit with what has happened. The time for sitting with it came later. For some men, much later. For some, it never fully came. The harbour on December 7th remained with them for the rest of their lives. Not as a memory exactly, but as something more continuous. A presence that did not diminish with time, but that they learned to carry alongside everything else. The West Virginia was salvaged. This was something Jimmy did not expect. And then, as the work progressed, came to follow with a specific intensity. She had settled on the bottom in an upright position, and the Navy's salvage teams determined that she could be raised. The work took months. Cofferdams were built around the hull. Pumps worked around the clock, removing the water from inside her. Slowly, over weeks, she rose. She rose. Jimmy watched her come up from the harbour floor, from the shore of Ford Island. He was not a sentimental man. He would not have described himself that way. But he stood and watched the ship rise, and felt something that he did not have a word for at the time, and that he would spend years afterward trying to describe accurately, usually giving up on the precise words and settling for something approximate. It was like watching someone get up after everything, getting up. The West Virginia was repaired at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. She was modernized, updated, given new systems and new armor, and new anti-aircraft capability that the pre-war design had not included. She returned to combat in 1944. She was present at the Battle of Surigao Strait in October of 1944, the last battleship versus battleship engagement in naval history. She fired her 16-inch guns at the Japanese fleet in the dark of the Surigao Strait, and the men aboard her knew, or had reason to believe, that they were repaying a debt. Jimmy was aboard her. He was 22 years old. He was a machinist's mate, second class. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. He came home in 1945. He went back to Pittsburgh. His father was still at the mill. His mother had aged in the way that mothers of sons at war age. His brothers were home, or coming home. He did not talk about Pearl Harbor for a long time. Not because it was too painful, though it was. Because it was too large. because there was no conversation that contained it properly, because the people who asked about it were asking about something they had read in a newspaper, and what he knew about it was something else entirely, something experienced in the body, in the dark, below the waterline, in the sound of metal under stress, and the tilt of a deck, and the burning water of the harbour, and the face of the man who pulled him into the boat. He married a woman from Pittsburgh named Marie. He worked for the city for 30 years. He had 3 children. He went to Pearl Harbor once more in 1991 for the 50th anniversary. He stood on the memorial over the Arizona. Through the grating beneath his feet, he could see the oil that still seeped from the sunken ship's fuel tanks. 50 years later, still rising, still reaching the surface in small iridescent patches that spread and dissipated in the harbour water. They call it the Arizona's tears. He stood over it for a long time. Then he walked back to the dock. He did not say anything to his son who had come with him. His son did not ask him to. Some things are understood by being stood next to. 2,403 Americans died at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Their names are recorded. The youngest was 16 years old, a sailor who had listed his age as 17 on his enlistment papers. The oldest was 62. Between those ages, every age that a man could be, every state in the Union, every background and religion and origin that America contained. They were there because they had signed a piece of paper and been given a uniform and assigned to a ship and told to be ready. They could not have known for what. When the moment arrived, they answered it. That is the whole story. That is all of it. They didn't know what Sunday morning would ask of them. They answered anyway. Rest now. You're safe tonight. Because of men like them.